the pro-war policies of the Russian regime and the fact that it continues to use Russian youth as cannon fodder on the front create a great dilemma for the Russian people. The Russian populace must decide between emigration and civil protest against the Putin government and its war policies. Both are, in truth, rebellions against the Putin government. This global conflict compelled all nations to take military, economic, socio-cultural, diplomatic, and political action. The war had the greatest impact on the populations of Russia and Ukraine, but it also had a significant impact on the inhabitants of Europe. The governments of the West took drastic action against President Putin's aggressive actions and demeanor. As of today, 11 significant Western sanctions have been imposed on the Russian economy. Putin's aggressive attitudes continued to draw the Russian people into a vast quagmire. And today, millions of Russians are starving, unemployed, and rebelling against Putin's policies. Moreover, when the second surge of full Russian mobilization is added, it becomes simple for the Russian people to remove President Putin from office. Russia has nearly depleted its military and economic resources in Ukraine for the past year and a half. Vladimir Putin, who brought Russia to this point of exhaustion, is best described by the phrase, "Everyone receives what they deserve." President Putin's war strategies are costing him dearly, and the Moscow army and Russia are moving toward darker times than those of Stalin. For Russian soldiers, especially in December, the Ukrainian territories were literally the Eastern Front of the Second World War. The Russian army's excessively aggressive war strategies brought the conflict to Russian cities. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens are fleeing their homes in the westernmost regions of Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk. Even the Russians in Crimea and Krasnodar are escaping into Russia's interior. Even the inhabitants of Kaliningrad, the Baltic exclave of Europe, no longer support the Russian government. More than 4,000 Russians are mobilizing for Kaliningrad's secession from Russia. More than 1 million Russians residing in the border cities of Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk are leaving their homes due to the devastating effects of the conflict. Now massive demonstrations are rocking the Kremlin in major Russian cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan, while Moscow's streets are boiling like a witch's cauldron. The Russian army is once again attempting to inflict a hefty mobilization blow on the Russian people. The initial emotion of the Russian people at the start of the conflict was confusion because Russia and Ukraine shared both historical and cultural similarities. Therefore, the Russians viewed the Ukrainians as being near to them as soon as the Russians recovered from the initial shock. The second stage began. At this point, the Russians began to support the conflict due to the leaders' statements and state television's propaganda efforts. Even throughout this process, support for President Putin has grown substantially with the declaration of partial mobilization by the Russian leader last autumn. The Russian people entered the third phase. At this point, the perspective of the Russian people on the Ukraine conflict and Putin began to shift. The war in Ukraine nearly brought the Russian army to its knees. According to the most recent Kremlin leaks, more than 300,000 Russian soldiers have perished. According to estimates, there are approximately 3 times as many wounded Russian personnel. All of these devastating losses created the possibility of a second mobilization surge in the country. When Vladimir Putin attempted to mobilize hundreds of thousands of his citizens to fight in his invasion of Ukraine, complete chaos, terror, and rage reverberated throughout Russia. If you recall, Russia was experiencing one of the most challenging periods in its history with the declaration of mobilization. The Russians realized that the conflict was affecting them in every aspect. Russia's decision to dispatch hundreds of thousands of troops to fight on Ukrainian battlefields prompted a mass exodus of Russians. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it is estimated that 900,000 Russian citizens and people residing in Russia left the country, including 300,000 by mid-March, 500,000 by the end of August, and an additional 400,000 at the start of October. After the end of October, Russian departures halted while anti-war demonstrations in Russia intensified. The Russians' wrath and the unrest in the Russian cities grew even worse as anti-war demonstrations intensify. The Kremlin once more makes a decision that enrages its citizens. Due to the dread of a second mobilization decision, Russia is currently undergoing a much heavier process in 2023. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens fled the country en masse as a result of the Kremlin's implementation of a new mobilization law, which caused widespread anxiety among the population. It is anticipated that migration will surpass 1.5 million by the middle of 2023, having reached approximately 1 million by the end of 2022. Therefore, what decisions and consequences led to the Russians leaving their country and emigrating? Let's delve into the specifics of the socio-political situation in Russia, which infuriates Russian citizens and compels them to oppose the Kremlin. Now, the conflict had reached Russian homes after the declaration of mobilization. Anxiety and apprehension dominated the Russian populace. This concern eventually gave way to protests and rebellion. A group of Russian wives and mothers implored President Vladimir Putin to stop sending their husbands and sons to their deaths by forcing them to join assault groups without proper training and supplies. In a video shared by the independent Russian Telegram channel Soda, the women claimed that their loved ones were forced to join assault groups at the beginning of March, despite having received only 4 days of training since their mobilization in September. Families of enlisted Russian men criticized the mobilization, stating that it was plagued by disciplinary and logistical problems, such as a lack of leadership among middle-ranking officers, a lack of training, inadequate uniforms, poor food, and inadequate medical apparatus. The Kremlin administration promptly began searching for replacements for the fallen soldiers. In this respect, Russian leader Vladimir Putin made a remarkable decision. President Putin, the leader of Russia, recently made the startling decision to prevent his citizens from evading military service. Vladimir Putin signed the new law prohibiting military desertion. This week, members of the Russian Duma approved the law in both houses of parliament. This decision may have significant ramifications for the Kremlin's war plans in Ukraine as it seeks to bolster Russian forces in anticipation of a Ukrainian counterattack. Fundamentally, the new law makes it incredibly difficult for the majority of Russian males, but also women with special skills, to avoid military service. In addition to 2022, it has been observed that hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have already begun to flee the country due to the socio-political repercussions of the conflict. The Russians utilize their only means of escape, as previously mentioned, illegitimate. Moreover, the new law introduced new applications. Up until now, Russian conscripts were required to physically visit a conscript's residence or place of employment to deliver a paper summons. This system will be supplanted by electronic notifications or emails sent via systems such as web portals that Russians use to pay their electricity bills, taxes, and other services. Thus, the Russian government will almost certainly deport its citizens to the front once the government of Moscow approves the submission. The electronic notification will be legally obligatory. Thus, the recruitment process will be significantly accelerated, and the legal process of conscription in Russia will now be controlled by a single button. Those who do not promptly present themselves at Russian recruitment offices will soon face new restrictions on banking, property sales, and driver's license access. The provisions that prohibit draft evaders from selling or transferring property prevent Russians who have escaped abroad, in particular, from liquidating their assets. This will undermine free will because the opinions of Russian citizens who oppose the conflict in Ukraine will become irrelevant. In reality, millions of Russian citizens in Russia oppose the Ukraine conflict. However, this decision by President Vladimir Putin forces Russian citizens into a conflict they do not want. It is nearly impossible for Russian citizens to object to the conscription decision prior to this reform. Individuals who disobeyed a military order faced up to 10 years in prison. Now, the penalties in this regard remain extremely severe. In the meantime, Kremlin officials and legislators have made it plain that they view the law as a response to difficulties in implementing Putin's partial mobilization decree, which called for 300,000 troops to fight in Ukraine last fall. In other words, President Putin initiated a clandestine mobilization to replace losses in the Russian army. In reality, the Russian leader's decision provided reinforcements for the front line, but as we mentioned, it also compelled hundreds of thousands of Russians to flee the country in order to avoid mandatory military service. Many anti-war Russians evaded military service by changing their addresses or alleging they did not receive the draft notice. Even now, Russian borders are beginning to shift, just as they did during mobilization. The reason for this is that violent escapes persist in Russia. Not only have escapes increased within Russia's borders, but also in the Crimea, as in the mobilization decision. Hundreds of thousands of Russians who did not want to participate in the Ukrainian war fled without considering the end, in order to establish a new order and escape the effects of the war. Yes, there are millions of people in Russia who are against this legislation. On the other hand, many people who back the Kremlin and Putin, that is, those who support the new law, have indicated that it is time to close the exemptions that contributed to some of the failures in mobilization that occurred in the previous year. These words are being taken as hints that Russia's entering a new period of instability. In contrast, the Kremlin maintains that the new law does not augur a second wave of mobilization in Ukraine, despite the fact that the opinion of certain specialists is skeptical about this assertion. In the coming months, it will become much more evident if the government in Moscow calls on more Russians to fight, particularly as Ukraine prepares to launch a counterattack to regain the occupied territory. This will be especially true as the situation continues to develop. In recent months, the Russian military has made a concentrated effort to recruit volunteers and has offered significantly higher pay to contract soldiers in order to send them to fight in Ukraine. A wage of $2,600 per month is being provided by the government of Moscow to Russian nationals who are interested in participating in the conflict. This is an absolutely staggering number for people living in Russia's smaller towns and rural communities. On the other hand, the Moscow administration was unable to supply its army with a sufficient number of personnel who were adequately compensated for their work. Putin has only one choice left at his disposal, and that is to enlist the assistance of his people in the battle. The Kremlin administration has said that the current situation has nothing to do with mobilization yet. What is currently occurring in Russia is mobilization. This is despite the fact that what is currently occurring in Russia is a mobilization. It would indicate that the authorities in Russia are aware of how unpopular the mobilization from the previous year was. A number of demonstrations and objections from members of the general public on a national scale were sparked by the shortage of military supplies and training for the conflict. Complaints of the type that Russians frequently air in public films were the source of a significant amount of stir as a direct result of the intensification of these responses in Russia. Vladimir Putin has started to acknowledge the occurrence of some unusual mistakes. However, if such a decision were made by the administration in Moscow, it would, as everyone had feared, result in total anarchy across the country and the dismantling of the professional organization of the Russian military. At the moment, however, the top priority for Russian government officials is recruiting more people to serve in the Russian armed forces. As a result, the Russians place an increased emphasis on quantity rather than quality at the moment. On the other hand, because of this condition, the Russians might end up losing the battle because Russian people who were conscripted into the fight will not voluntarily serve on Ukrainian soil for the duration of the conflict. On the other hand, it would appear that this situation makes the casualties suffered by the Russian army much worse. In spite of all of these obstacles, the Russian Ministry of Defense has announced intentions to bring the total number of personnel in the army up by 30% to 1.5 million. This figure represents the addition of many 100,000 soldiers to the existing army, in addition to the volunteers who have voluntarily contracted their services. However, a significant number of respected military experts feel that Vladimir Putin will be unable to achieve this goal. In fact, getting someone to do something against their will is a really difficult task when it comes down to it. The Russian government is essentially writing its own death sentence by enlisting its own people in the military against their will. As things are, the situation will become even more dire if Russian citizens are coerced into making such a decision at a time when they do not have faith in their government as a direct result of the conflict in Ukraine. Putin, the current leader of Russia, is not changing his strategy and is continuing to play each card in his hand individually. Despite this, the Russian leader's options started to become increasingly limited as time went on. It looks like Russia may soon find itself back in the difficult circumstances of the Soviet era. The aftermath of the war led Russia to the precipice of social and economic disintegration. To put it another way, we are presently watching the territory that formerly comprised the Soviet Union during its most dangerous periods of the battle. In spite of the fact that the Ukraine-Russian conflict has pulled Moscow's economy into the stormy Black Sea ports, the number of part-time employees in Russia has climbed by 7.3% to 450,000. On average, 15% of employees working for large and medium-sized businesses in Russia are still working part-time. The ramifications of the situation in Ukraine make it impossible for Russian citizens to establish long-term strategies for their businesses. If you haven't already observed, the rise in the number of people working in Russia on a part-time basis would have a far more significant and detrimental effect on the country in the event of a comprehensive forced mobilization or an extraordinarily unfavorable circumstance as a result of the situation in Ukraine. Disguised unemployment in Russia has reached previously unheard of levels. According to information gathered in the waning days of December, the number of people working in businesses in Russia who are classified as being underemployed has reached 5 million. This staggering percentage is considerably greater than the unemployment rates that were experienced in Russia throughout the pandemic since 2010. This figure has represented Russia's underemployment rate at its highest point ever recorded. It would appear that the nation, led by Vladimir Putin, has set a new standard in this particular domain. Because of the conflict, at least 5 million Russians have taken up arms against the administration of Vladimir Putin, and the number of those taking part in the uprising is growing. We anticipate that the months of January and February will bring the most significant challenges for the administration of Russia. Vladimir Putin has provided the Russian military with unlimited financial resources and authorized the addition of 350,000 people. This will have a devastating impact on the Russian people, and as a result, millions of them will march on the Kremlin and try to break down its doors. In addition, the number of Russian vacationers who choose to spend their time on the Mediterranean beaches of Turkey, particularly those of Antalya, has traditionally seen a significant decline in the third quarter of 2022, as well as throughout the mobilization period. There will be a mobilization of 3.3 million people. The Russian citizen covered all of his own costs throughout his vacation. In contrast, more than half of these individuals decided to take a vacation rather than comply with the required military duty requirement that was imposed by the Moscow administration. At the moment, almost no one has the ability to take a holiday in Russia because it is so difficult to get a visa. The continued imposition of sanctions by Western nations against Russia is the root cause of this situation. Sanctions of a severe nature have been placed on Russia by Western nations in response to the beginning of Russia's military invasion of Ukraine. There were more than 250 international firms that left the Russian market. The most recent information suggests that many of the world's most well-known firms, including Apple, Airbnb, Microsoft, IBM, and many others, have halted all manufacturing and sales in Russia. These companies include Renault, Mazda, and Toyota, as well as McDonald's, Microsoft, and IBM. Other brands that have left Russia include Airbnb, Netflix, and Apple. Netflix is one of the firms that has sustained the greatest amount of financial damage as a direct result of the conflict that has been going on between Russia and Ukraine. During the first 3 months of 2022, Netflix had a drop of 200,000 customers, indicating that the company's economic income had reached a degree of disintegration comparable to that of Russia. However, Netflix executives have stated that the company will not continue operations in Russia, despite the fact that they are losing a significant amount of money there. It was just a few hours before the start of the new year when it was estimated that the drop in GDP in Russia, which has been impacted in every industry, was 2.5%. Emily Blanchard, who serves as the chief economist for the United States Department of State, projects that the Russian economy will experience a decline of at least 20% by the 2030s. Do you think the Russian economy will continue to thrive until the year 2030? If anything is unclear, please elaborate in the comments. According to our projections, Russia will most likely not be able to maintain its current standard of living until the year 2030 as a direct result of Vladimir Putin's policy of ignoring any and all unfavorable developments. Because the government of the United States and, as was indicated before, the nations of Western Europe continue to exert pressure on the government of Moscow by imposing extremely severe economic sanctions. What can you tell us about the creative solutions that the Russian State Duma plans to implement in order to pull the country out of its current economic slump? Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the State Duma, made the announcement that Russian residents who choose to leave the country should have fewer options, then be subject to a higher tax rate. This is exactly what is expected from Moscow, which through the decision to mobilize, compels the Russian people to stand guard on the fighting fronts in Ukraine. This is exactly what is expected from Moscow. Those who have left Russia are able to continue working remotely for Russian enterprises as well as enjoy all of the legislative benefits granted by the Moscow administration, according to the State Duma. This is something that should not be the case, but it is. In the event that a state turns its back on its own people, there is a significant chance that a full-scale popular uprising will take place. Vladimir Putin and the administration working out of the Kremlin are of the opinion that the proposition that was given by the Russian State Duma is actually fairly hopeful. The Russian people are the intended targets of the decisions that have recently been made by the Kremlin. Even though he was in the midst of his mobilization, Vladimir Putin referred to Russian citizens who took part in anti-war demonstrations against Ukraine as traitors in Vladimir Putin's eyes. Local Russians who left the mobilization were also considered traitors. In a nutshell, the whole population of Russia, including those who currently oppose Putin, has been labeled as traitors. After all of this political crap, the decision that had been made by the Russian State Duma was upheld. Now, Russian citizens working outside of the country are required to pay taxes equal to 13% of their salary. According to this ruling, a Russian citizen will be deemed to have abandoned his or her tax residency if they are absent from the nation for more than 183 days in the past. The Russian Ministry of Finance demanded that Russian residents who worked outside of the country pay a Russian tax rate that was much higher before this decision was made by the State Duma. The Russian ministry advocated raising the tax rate on individuals who operate outside of Russia by up to 30%. The way that Vladimir Putin's finance ministry operated was exactly the same as the way that his own ministry did, as if bringing criminal charges against innocent people was one of the core values upheld by the Russian government. Vladimir Putin's political isolation deepened as the Russian population in its many regions approached the threshold of exhaustion. Kiev is striving to acquire an advantage against Russia and Putin, with the support of the actors who set the military and political balances in the United States and Western Europe. Those actors include the United States and NATO. The Ukrainian military is fully aware of what it has to accomplish, as well as its principal goal in relation to this matter. Since the commencement of the conflict, the Ukrainians have made important attacks on Russian territory using unmanned aerial vehicles. These attacks have been carried out by the Ukrainian military. In general, these territories were made up of communities that were located on the border, such as Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk. Would it be possible for the Ukrainian army to use its offensive capability and launch an attack that would hit Vladimir Putin and Russia where it hurts the most? Let's find together the unanticipated answers to the dilemma that has brought the Russian people and Vladimir Putin to a standstill in their relationship. You might remember that in the most recent weeks, anti-aircraft systems were found to be installed on the rooftops of significant Moscow buildings such as the Ministry of Defense. These systems were put in place for an extremely important reason, because the Kremlin was concerned that high-value targets could be attacked by Ukraine or by individuals who sympathized with Ukraine. Air strikes were avoided concerning issues such as these. It was revealed that not only Putin, but also the nation of the Russian people as a whole no longer enjoys a stable position. Citizens of Russia had no desire to fight on the front lines of the conflict in Ukraine, and they also had no desire to live in an insecure situation in their home country. Fear and panic gripped the Russian people when they witnessed 3 consecutive drone assaults on the nation's capital, Moscow. During this period of upheaval in the country, the major element that prompted considerable dissatisfaction among the Russian public was the assaults that took place in Moscow. Following the attacks carried out using drones in the Russian capital, it is widely thought that cities around Russia are being attacked from the sky. It is easy to find yourself in a life-threatening position while walking the streets of St. Petersburg or Moscow. So in light of these attacks, what actions is Russia taking in response? Think about the people who responded with violence to the events that happened in spite of the fact that the majority of the continuing battle is being fought in Ukraine. A murky but increasingly active front has arisen on the territory that President Vladimir Putin calls home. Several groups that claim to be Russian and are hostile to the way the Kremlin is handling the conflict have taken up arms and claimed responsibility for significant operations such as acts of sabotage, the damage of infrastructure, and the assassination of major figures. Experts who have undertaken significant research on the groups and their leaders have provided fresh insights into the organization's goals and strategies. Although relatively little is known about the involvement of these rebel groups in Moscow's definition of terrorism, these new insights have been provided by experts who have provided new information. The major goal of these Russian dissident groups is to put a halt to heinous situations like the most recent drone assaults in Moscow and to persuade Putin not to carry on with this war. It is possible that these Russian rebel groups will engage in military conflict in order to accomplish their goal. However, it is disputed whether the people of Russia or the officials in the Kremlin are to blame for the grave predicament that the country currently finds itself in. As can be seen, the people of Russia were at a loss as to how to react to the injustices and repressive government that they were forced to suffer. And as a result, they occasionally responded in a more violent manner. Despite this, the threat that the Russian people and various opposition organizations present to the Putin dictatorship has significant ramifications. The immediate aftermath of the invasion that took place in 2022 resulted in the detention of thousands of anti-war activists across Russia. During the time when the Soviet Union was in existence, there was a widespread practice of coerced cooperation and suppression. However, in the overall scheme of things, there are some noteworthy deviations from the norm. What are the feelings and thoughts of the average Russian citizen about this matter? Everyone in Russia is aware of the difficult situation you are in. Perhaps there are some people who are unaware of this information and who are able to function normally without it. There is a possibility that some people who are conscious of the fact that they are being repressed engage in their own brain training in order to persuade themselves that they are acting in the appropriate manner. The parties who are aware of the oppressive rule in Russia have the option of either fleeing the nation and starting a new life in 2023, or being compelled to live in Russia during the time of the Soviet Union. On the other side, remaining politically neutral is useful in Russia since it lowers the level of tension experienced by Russian citizens. Those citizens of Russia who do not agree are at risk of being imprisoned. If you get too involved in the political process in Russia, which has been the case ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you could end up in jail. Taking into account the risks posed by this repression regime, Vladimir Putin is currently putting a policy quite similar to this one into effect in Russia. How, therefore, is it possible for the president of a country that is being subjected to such strong pressure to not be able to halt the repeated drone assaults in Moscow? As was mentioned earlier, it appears that the attacks in Moscow culminated in the dishonor of the Russian leader and ushered in a new level of disorder throughout the country. The Russian people have gained a greater appreciation for the magnitude of the danger posed by the possibility of war. As a direct result of the strikes on Moscow, as a direct consequence of the attacks that took place in Moscow, the city's whole airspace was immediately and completely shut down to all flights, and all traffic came to an immediate and complete standstill. In addition, strong security measures were deployed throughout the city, such as intensive inspections and lengthy vehicle convoys. These measures were put into place to protect the population. The implementation of these security measures gave the impression that Russia had completely disintegrated into anarchy. Additionally, the population of Russia was worn down as a result of these assaults, which indicated that there was no longer an established order in Russia. 2 Ukrainian drones reportedly carried out an overnight attack on the Kremlin, which is located in the heart of Moscow. According to a stunning statement released by the Russian presidential administration, it would appear that Russian soldiers used radar technology to defeat enemy drones because President Putin was unharmed in spite of the fact that there were no casualties among those who attempted to kill him during these incidents. On the other hand, the Kremlin has described each of these incidents as an attempt to murder Vladimir Putin. In response, Ukraine stated that it would not carry out the attack and accused Russia of being behind it. After that, a lot of fascinating films portraying the attempted murders of the president leaked online following what appeared to be a large explosion. Images that were uploaded on social media showed at least one drone flying in the direction of the Kremlin in yet another video. What appears to be smoke and flames rising from the Kremlin dome can be seen as a direct response to these terrible efforts at assassination. The airspace over Moscow was immediately shut down to all airplanes and all traffic was brought to a halt. In addition, strong security measures were deployed throughout the city, such as intensive inspections and lengthy vehicle convoys. These measures were put into place to protect the population. The implementation of these security measures gave the impression that Russia had completely disintegrated into anarchy. Additionally, the killings of Putin depleted the energy of the Russian public and proved that there was no longer a predetermined order in Russia. On the other hand, there were a lot of rumors going around about people trying to kill the Russian leader. However, if the Kremlin's allegations are true, and this is a genuine attempt on the life of the president, it would be an extraordinarily embarrassing event for the Kremlin to be involved in. It is certain that questions will be asked about the safety of Vladimir Putin in Russia, as well as the effectiveness of the Russian air defense system. It would appear that Mr. Putin has one of the strictest security protocols of any world leader, according to all accounts. However, Putin and Russia have been found wanting in this test regarding drone assaults that have taken place over the past few days. The most recent manifestation of this phenomenon was seen in the attacks carried out by drones in Moscow. On the other side, Russian women are paying a high price for their participation in demonstrations against Putin's conflict. According to the data, the bulk of people jailed in Russia's protests against President Vladimir Putin's support for the fight in Ukraine are women. These protests were directed against Putin's involvement in the crisis in Ukraine. There is widespread concern among Russian men that if they demonstrate, they will be forced to serve in the military. According to the records filed in the case during the opening weeks of the confrontation in Moscow in February and March, more women were accused of participating in anti-war rallies than had been charged with participating in anti-Putin demonstrations in previous years. Ella Rossman, a scholar at the School of Slavic and Eastern European Studies at University College London, ascribed the surge in women's participation in protests to the worries of certain conscripts and a nascent Russian feminist movement. Rossman worked at the School of Slavic and Eastern European Studies. Through documenting Russian feminist action, Rossman was able to raise the number of Russian feminist groups from approximately 30 in 2019 to 45 in 2021. Women took to more than just the streets to voice their opposition to the fighting. A short time after the outbreak of hostilities, Rossman and a number of other activists established a movement known as the Feminist Anti-War Resistance. According to the minister, not only did his people write about the conflict on social media and distribute a newspaper in Russia, but they also scrawled anti-war slogans on ruble banknotes and store price tags. This was done in addition to posting about the conflict on social media in response to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The Russian people have started to come together in opposition to the move. There was once a spark that kindled the rebellious spirit of the Russians. It was impossible to put an end to this blaze until the Russian commander had been burned to the ground. The number of people participating in the demonstrations, in particular Russian women, increased each day. The flower protests were the final of several different movements of protest. Let's get some additional information on the flower protest. It is common knowledge that the city of Dnipro was the scene of one of the bloodiest incidents that occurred during the Moscow occupation last month. Dozens of Ukrainians were killed in the Russian missile attack on their country. While Russia has denied responsibility for the attack, officials and journalists sympathetic to the Kremlin have advanced the theory that the explosion was caused by the air defenses of Ukraine. The horrifying photographs of the demolished apartment building, civilian casualties, and desperate rescue attempts that followed his attack in Dnipro were a frightening reminder of the devastation created by the fighting in Ukraine, and they enraged and embarrassed several Russians. His attack in Dnipro was a stark reminder of the destruction that has been produced by the conflict in Ukraine. Following this attack, Russians all over the country have continued to mourn the deaths in what has developed into a novel form of anti-war protest across the country. The commemorations that are currently taking place for the victims of the attack on Dnipro are the first nationwide anti-war marches to take place since the demonstrations against partial mobilization that took place in September. Statues of Ukrainian poets Taras Shevchenko and Lesya Ukrainka, as well as memorials to victims of political repression during the time of the Soviet Union, are commonly decorated with improvised flowers, plush animals, and scribbled comments in at least 60 Russian localities. A woman who was placing flowers during a memorial service in Novosibirsk, Siberia, observed that this is not just a mourning for those who died in the Dnipro, but also a declaration against war. A man from the Khanty-Mansiysk autonomous area said to demonstrate that not all Russians are cruel to Ukrainians. I decided to lay flowers at a local monument while he was holding a flower in his hand. The man was from the Khanty-Mansi autonomous region. Residents of the city of Krasnodar in southern Russia were said to have tied yellow carnations with blue and yellow ribbons, which are the colors of the Ukrainian flag, and left them on the streets. There are images of the demolished Dnipro apartment complex in the city of Kazan, which is located on the Volga River, next to a memorial to the victims of political repression. There is also a placard that reads "Kazan is in mourning." Equal protection for all member states is a vital measure for demonstrating the alliance's unity, resolve, and collective defense not just to existing members, but also to partner nations and possible new members. This is because equal protection for all member states is a measure that demonstrates the alliance's solidarity, resolve, and collective defense. Uli Air Base in Lithuania was selected as the location for a NATO air policing capability in 2004, the same year that all three Baltic states, members of NATO in 2014 in response to Russia's unlawful and illegitimate annexation of Crimea. A second air police presence was established at Estonia's Meri Air Base as part of NATO's assurance measures for Eastern allies. These measures were put into place at the base, if my memory serves me well. Putin's air force was continuously blocked in this key airspace before the RAF was able to stop Russian jets from flying in the Baltics as part of their role as NATO air police in the Baltic states. Bombers maintain a constant presence over the Baltic Sea in order to locate and escort Russian aircraft that violate the flight norms for international airspace. For example, in the most recent few months, fighters belonging to the NATO Air Police have observed a Russian Tupolev Tu-134 aircraft flying through international airspace while traveling from the Kaliningrad area of the Russian Federation to the Russian mainland. As a result of the length of their flights, the Russian aircraft in question were not allowed to participate in any potentially dangerous maneuvers or flights in the airspace over the Baltic Sea or over Kaliningrad. As a conclusion, RAF Typhoon fighters, Swedish Gripens, and other NATO air forces now closely protect the Baltics against the risky maneuvers and flights of the Russian Air Force. It is forbidden for Russian Air Force aircraft to fly through these airspaces. So tell me, what are your ideas around this subject matter? I would greatly appreciate it if you could share your thoughts in the comment box below.